All right. Well, welcome to episode 15 of Sketchy Talk. And today we're talking to Rose Catherine Kahn. She is a fantasy illustrator from Orlando, Florida. Over the past decade, she has created designs and illustrations for clients across the country. Her artwork sells internationally, and her collections can be found in gift shops around the world. She particularly enjoys illustrating puzzles and designing figurines for companies including Ravensburger Games, Buffalo Games, Aquarius, and Pacific Giftware. In December of 2019, Rose completed a series of puzzles that can be found at retailers including Target, Walmart, and Michaels. Since 2019, she has continued to populate the world with intricate puzzle artwork, completing her 17th puzzle at the start of 2023. In addition to fantasy illustration, in 2014, Rose released her debut fantasy novel, Centurnia: Return to the Castle. In 2018, it was followed by Mark of the Castle. The third, Whispers in the Azure, arrived in 2022. Rose has a second edition lined up for 2023, along with a fourth book. When not illustrating and writing, Rose is a professor of art at Rochester Institute of Technology. So, welcome, Rose. It's great. That's impressive
Oh,
credentials there.
good morning. Oh, thank you. Thank you. And actually, I need to update that because I have just completed my 20th puzzle design.
Wow, that's
So,
really impressive.
yeah.
And do very intricate work on these puzzles.
Mhm.
And I was looking, you had sent me when we were talking, preparing for this interview, you had sent me some images of your process where you do a bunch of thumbnails to kind of figure out each of these puzzles. What kind of creative brief do you get for the puzzles, or do you sort of propose several ideas to them?
So there's a couple ways that the puzzles happen. So when I actually get direction from the art directors, it really varies by company. So sometimes they'll come to me with a statement like, "Hey, can you do a landscape with something like your time dragons, but a bunch of dragons, but in the landscape?" And then I will do a series of sketches. Usually, I will personally. I try to force myself to do at least 40 thumbnails for each illustration, and then I'll like pare it down to my top three, and then I will submit it to the art director, and they'll be like, yes, no. Sometimes they're really vague, and they might be something like, hey, we liked your Glimmerstone Bakery. Could you do that, but with no people, but not a bakery, but something similar? And it'll be like a conversation we'll be having over Zoom, and I'll be like, oh, okay, similar to a bakery, but not a bakery. What about an ice cream parlor? Which is where I've got Stardust Scoops is going to be a piece coming out with Ravensburger. So that might be how the conversation goes. Each of the puzzle companies has their own requirements and preferences. Like some of them prefer designs without people in them because they want their puzzlers to be able to sort of envision themselves in the space. Some puzzle companies they absolutely love the fantasy and they want more of it. Some of our puzzle companies we've been finding have been like, "Hey, can you do this but without the dragons in the universe or unicorns, so it'll like feel fanciful but not be true fantasy." So they're all very, very, very particular. So like that's one way that it happens. The other way, my favorite way, my preferred way, is I just create the images on my own. And so I have, as you mentioned in my bio, I have the universe of Centurnia, which is a universe that I've been working in for probably seriously at least the last 10 years. And it's a very well structured world. I have a good sense of the magic system. I have a good sense of the characters. So it's a very lived in universe for me. And I will draw directly from that, and I will pick characters and scenes, some directly out of the books, some that are in the future or the past of the timeline, whatever strikes me at the moment. And I will then just create those images and then present them to my agent, who then takes them to the puzzle companies. And sometimes the puzzle companies will pick them up in like a couple weeks. Sometimes the designs will sit while, like, so for example, the Summer Night Circus image, that one was floating around for well over a year before any puzzle companies decided to pick that one up. And that one's now being produced. I believe is Schmidt and Spiel is producing that in the UK. And so that's my favorite because it's usually those particular puzzles that I get the most feedback about. Like people will send me emails and be like, "Oh, I know I loved this image. I feel like there's a story there, and they're right, and they definitely pick up on that. Um, wow, I think that was a very long answer to your very simple
No, no,
question,
no,
but
it's really,
it's
and
a
one
really
thing that I
interesting
really
process.
enjoyed was that you had so many thumbnails. I mean, that's something I'm always hammering into my students' heads. We always do a series of thumbnails before we even do sketches, and you always try to make sure they understand the importance of
Hmm.
coming up with ideas before they just start drawing on the paper and
Hmm.
just especially with your pieces where they're very complicated. You want to think about the design. I mean, one of the big aspects of illustration, I think, is its integration with design, and figuring out where you're going to put everything is really important.
That thumbnail process is actually, even though I'm like a seasoned professional, it's sometimes hard for me, which is why I forced myself to make that sheet basically. It's like if you notice, if you look through a lot of my process work, it's the same grid, which has I think technically it's like 42 squares or something like that. But I don't allow myself to start the finished piece until I've gone through all of them, because each of these finished puzzles illustrations, they're over 100 hours of work. And I've learned the lesson that like I don't want to start something and then figure out, oh, I could have made a stronger composition.
Yes.
So it's like it's discipline. And sometimes I am tempted, like, oh, this is an early sketch. I love this. Let me just run with it. But I've learned that can sometimes bite me. And sometimes, if I do have a better sketch earlier on, well, it's still going to emerge as the best sketch when I'm looking back through those sheets.
Hmm.
Another thing with the puzzle industry in particular, so my images are typically pretty large when they're produced. A finished puzzle, most of them when they're like 1,000 piece puzzle, they're 21 by 28 inches. When they're 2,000, 3,000 piece puzzles, they could go up to 4 feet.
Really?
And
Wow.
yeah,
That's a
yeah.
big
Those are
puzzle.
the big guys are like 4 feet, like 48 inches, which is that's a whole nother story with how as a digital artist you produce that without running out of RAM. And I've got stories there. But anyway, so when you're doing something like this, so the image has to be awesome at that scale, but at the same time, it's being sold as a like 2 inch by 3 inch image that's on the side of a puzzle box when it's sitting on the shelf of Target. So I need to make sure that whatever that thumbnail is, it looks really cool when it's like super duper tiny. And that's really the tail. I mean, that's where most of the design thinking and process goes. That's where I'm constantly, as I'm working on my puzzles. So they're very bright and very colorful, as you've probably noticed. But I'm constantly swapping it to grayscale to make sure that the values read very strongly, and it's got to really have a good punch at that initial thumbnail stage. Otherwise, it's going to fail as a final image. And there's been a few of my puzzles where the values have gotten away from me towards the end with the color. Actually, Summer Night Circus is that exact one that the values weren't quite right. It was still a really cool, intricate image. It wasn't licensing. So then
Hmm.
I went back and I updated the image and I punched the values a little bit more, dark's a little darker, light's a little lighter. And I changed just some minor things in the composition. And after I did that, we put it back in my portfolio. And within several months, my agent was able to get it licensed at that point. And I really think that it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't taken the time to go back and adjust the value on the image.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's extremely crucial when you're, especially images like that. And I didn't think about with puzzles, you would have to have it detailed to a degree differently than perhaps other types of, like, book
Hmm.
illustrations is mostly what I do, and you don't have to worry about everything being so tight in every aspect. But in
Hmm.
this, like, it probably sells better when you have all these little details because people probably love seeing them.
Yeah, that's the way the mentality of the puzzle industry is. Every single piece is a clue. So I literally put grids on my puzzle paintings as they get towards finished. And they're grids where there I have literally 1,000 squares if it's going to be a 1,000 piece image, and I make sure every single square has something unique to it. whether it be just simply having a sharp line or a part of an object or a butterfly wing. It is interesting because, yeah, in other aspects of illustration, you can get away with having softer things or atmospheric things. And I'm really like not allowed to do that basically because everything in my images has to be sharp. But by the same token, I still have to make sure I'm conveying a sense of depth. And there's a balancing act. Now, of course, I mean, you'll see puzzles on the shelves that, have softer lines or maybe not as good as an image. It's always up to the art director's discretion as far as like what they might be thinking of. Like, so for example, if it's a big property, right? The a puzzle company might be more likely to be like, yeah, we'll get an image that's a little fuzzy in the background because it's the Mandalorian and this is what
Yeah, yeah,
Disney says we can
exactly.
have. So that'll be, but when it's something that's like the work that I do, where it's not a licensed IP, where it's got to stand on its own. I've got a very specific set of rules to basically follow with how I generate my images that is just a little different than if you were doing like a book cover illustration or a magic card. But it's something that I've had to learn, and I've learned over the years after working with multiple art directors from different companies. And so now I'm at the point that I have a good sense of what they're going to look for and what they're going to like, at least in the quality of the image itself. Now, as far as art director preferences, as far as what they license, like they're always trying to guess the trends. And so I'm
Yes.
always trying to guess the trends before they guess the trends. And then other
Hmm.
companies, they have certain preferences for what they're looking for. So it's a game. It
Hmm.
really is. It's absolutely a game.
So let's back up a little bit and talk a little bit about your every illustration career is unique. So how did you get into you started now you do mostly licensed stuff, but talk a little bit about your education and sort of your journey to get here.
Okay. So I'm one of those kids who I was always drawing when I was a child. I was constantly drawing horses nonstop. I'd get like horse books out from the libraries and then I would like try to draw the horses. I've always been a nerd. I've always been into like Star Wars and Marvel and Sailor Moon and anime and all of that. And I've always been kind of a Disney nerd too. Like when I was younger, I said I want to grow up and I want to be an animator for Disney. Like that was the dream goal. And of course, when I was saying this was still the era that it was all hand drawn. And so when I graduated from high school, which was in 2002, um, I did like a little mini internship at a local animation studio. And what those artists told me is don't go to school for animation, go to school for drawing, for illustration, for something
Oh,
like that. Because,
interesting.
yeah, because they said if you could draw, you could do anything. But if you pigeonhole yourself into animation, you might find trouble, especially if so I lived in Syracuse, New York at the time. They're like, you might have to travel. Also, they were seeing the changes that were happening in the animation industry, I think, because that was when digital was really starting to become a thing. That's when you started to also see more and more animation being outsourced overseas. And they also expressed to me, like, if you're all about the storytelling aspect, if you, even if you do become, a legendary Disney animator, you're going to spend your entire career like drawing one hand, and your day to day is going to be like manipulating a hand. Like, you're going to be like, and so they were like, you're going to have a much better chance in industry if you go with something a little broader, like illustration. And, this was the recommendation of like, you know, one or two guys in a small animation studio in Syracuse, New York in 2002. But like it's all I had to go on. So I went to RIT and I got a degree in illustration, was my bachelor's degree. And I was smart enough and fortunate enough to kind of fall into getting an associate's degree in graphic design. Actually, I was lucky enough because my roommate happened to be a graphic designer. And once I had seen what graphic design was, actually, funny thing is, my high school art teacher, she told me don't get a degree in graphic design because she said I'd hate it. And so I took her advice at face value until I got to RIT and I had a roommate who was a graphic designer and I saw the work she was doing and I was like, oh, this, I don't know why my high school art teacher told me don't do this. This is pretty cool. Now, I think what happened is my high school art teacher was coming out of the era where when she was a graphic designer, it was still like paste up graphic
Oh,
design
yes.
and not digital because we were still, I was in that era of the Adobe products were just becoming a thing. I knew more about digital art than any of my teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And so anyway, so I graduated with these degrees, and in retrospect, it was a very smart move because it was graphic design that was my primary way of earning, and it's still a supplemental way of earning because I understand typography and page layout and things like that. So it was a good move. What ended up happening is when I graduated, even though I was, as I said, I was always a nerd. I was always into fantasy illustrated. Like for me, my dream job would have been like to work for Wizards of the Coast or, do stuff for Magic or work for Marvel. Like that's what I wanted to do. But um, unfortunately, when I was assembling my portfolio my senior year of college, I didn't get the right guidance. I think the faculty at the time was still of the mindset that, children's book illustration or really heavy on the editorial illustration.
Which hardly
Um,
exists anymore.
yeah, it's hilarious in retrospect. And so their view of illustration was kind of narrow, and they looked down at anime and things that were cartoony or things like
And they
everything I
still do.
loved.
They still do.
Oh my gosh, it's
Yeah, they
so
still do.
obnoxious. When I'm oh, I gotta tell you, when I teach, so as professor for 8 years, I also taught at the K-12 level. I've taught high school art, and my students, they, especially I always give them a project where they could freely express whatever style they want to. And I tell them, unless we're doing true figure drawing or whatever, like, yeah, no, anime is cool. Like, it's just as valid a style as anything else. And my students always respond to that, like, what, wait, what did you say? You said you're cool with me doing some manga art in your classroom? And I'm like, yeah, because if it's what you're passionate about and why you're
Exactly.
into doing art, like, why would I just, okay, I have stories for that. Oh my gosh, I have stories of that and conversations I have had with other art teachers that were not pleasant conversations, but I'm gonna pull it back and go back to my,
No,
my
no,
story here. But
yeah.
oh my gosh, I could tell stories. Anyway, so I graduate, and I didn't do anything with fantasy. My portfolio didn't really have any fantasy because I felt like it didn't have a place. I wasn't going to get work. It was just it's very down on myself. So I started building a portfolio that was a little bit more of a graphic design, a little more corporate design. And that's where I got my first job and more of a corporate design position. I worked for a company that did products for schools, libraries, and museums. So it was a lot of catalog work, advertising. They had 1,000-page catalog. So it was all
Wow, that
these
sounds
laying out,
tortuous.
oh my God, these charts, these freaking charts. Like
I
you
can
wouldn't
imagine.
believe how many SKUs you'd have for book supports or the little paper pockets that go in library books or circulation.
Yes.
It was a very tedious thing. Now, the wonderful thing about that job is I was with a really great department of artists who taught me a lot about photography. It was the start of email marketing, who really, really laid into me hard on like printing requirements. Like when I was graduated, even though I had a degree in graphic design, I didn't understand what print bleeds were and why they were important. And like that's how there was that gap in my knowledge. And I remember one of the other designers in my department, she got so annoyed at me because I had forgotten to put bleeds on a document that she
Oh
wrote
no.
bleeds on a post-it note and stuck it on my monitor. And then somebody from another department walked by and like, why does your desk say something about bleeding? And I'm like, no, it's a print. And it was funny.
That's
I learned a
hilarious.
lot in that department. I learned a lot
Hmm.
from all of those artists and things that have stuck with me ever since. What ended up happening though, it was still very corporate. I was in a cubicle. The work wasn't very interesting. So I started to think, you know what, maybe graphic design isn't for me. Maybe my high school art teacher was right, and this is what I'd hate. So I ran away and I got a master's degree in education because that sounded like a good idea at the time. And I enjoy teaching, and I'm so glad I did that because that's afforded me a lot of interesting opportunities. It's how I later became a professor at RIT. But unfortunately, when I graduated, it was 2008, it was the recession, and they
Oh
were
yeah.
cutting teacher jobs left and right. So it's like when I went into this degree program, it looked like they were hiring, at least one or two art teachers a year, and that at some of the districts I was looking at. And then by the time I graduated, it was like cutting teachers, cutting teachers.
Uh,
Art is the first to go. I'm like,
yes.
crud. So I ended up in a position where I did fortunately get a part-time job as an art teacher. It was at a K-12 private school. And to supplement my income, I ended up getting work as a part-time graphic designer for a company called Red Bottle Design. It was run by some guys that I had graduated with who were very skilled in web design. So they pulled me on as a graphic designer. So for a while, I was in this dual career. I was like, a
Mhm.
couple days a week I'd be the art teacher, and a couple days a week I was a graphic designer. And that was fun. But it was still not what I wanted to do. And the way I finally found my way back into illustration, and it was at that point about 10 years after graduation, I was fortunate enough to have a friend who saw the type of work I was drawing for fun. And
Mhm.
she was like, "Hey, I do anime cons. You might want to try that too. Like, why don't you come with me? I'm going to go. I think it was UBCon, which is up in Buffalo, New York."
Yes. Uh-huh.
And she was like, "Hey, I'm gonna get a table. Why don't you get a table? Why don't you bring your work and we'll see how it goes?" And I'm like, "Okay, cool. That sounds like a fun thing to do." Because I'd attended conventions. Like I liked going to New York Comic Con and PAX East, but I'd never thought of tabling at a convention. And if you're not familiar, just the term tabling for those of you who are listening out there is basically when you purchase a table either in the artist alley or the vendor section of these conventions and sell your goods. So I did UBCon and it was amazing. And it was the first time that I think I had some Sailor Moon fan art. I think I had done some My Little Pony fan art and I had drawn some like really cute little kittens. And
Yeah.
people reacted and I got such a high off of that feedback. Like, wow, people actually liked the stuff that I like to draw. And that was when the door opened and I started going with my friend and we started doing more conventions after that. And through that convention process is when I really started to develop my portfolio because at some point, I think I was sketching dragons for the fun of it. And I turned to my husband. I was like, what should I draw with this dragon? He's like, a clock. A clock would be cool with a dragon. And that was the start of my Time Dragon series. And those sold like gangbusters at the
Wow.
conventions as prints. And I was like, okay, well, because I was getting that wonderful direct feedback as far as what sold and what the beautiful intersection of both what the market wanted and what I wanted to draw.
Exactly. Well,
And oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, no, go on.
Um,
Sorry.
oh no, you're fine. You're fine. Um, I think around that point, I started listening to there was a YouTube channel run by Bridget Ashwood, and it was called Art Share. And
Uh-huh.
her aspect, I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but she's done a ton of work in fantasy licensing. And
Mhm.
I didn't really have an awareness of what licensing was. It was something that they didn't teach us in college, and none of my friends were doing it. And licensing, for those of you who aren't familiar, is basically you have a body of work and you present it to companies. And if the companies like the work, they will put the art on their products and give you a royalty. And usually the royalty is very, very, very small. But the money in licensing is earned over once you have a lot of products with a lot of different companies, then the checks get bigger quarter to quarter and it's paid quarterly, so like every 3 months I get a check. So anyways, I started following her, Bridget Ashwood's YouTube channel, and learning really how to structure a portfolio with licensing in mind. And I started to notice that the advice that applied to licensing helped me do better at conventions. So then at that point, I think I started incorporating unicorns into my portfolio. So then I had a collection of the time dragons. I had a whole set of them, and then I had a whole set of unicorns. And then I had some of the stuff I was starting to develop for Centurnia, and I think that was the point. So my career really took off in about 2012, 2013 is where everything started to really come together for me. On both the Centurnia side of things and in the licensing side of things. So I think Centurnia was technically first. So what happened with that was I had started developing a webcomic for fun. And I had some friends who approached me because they got a table at New York Comic Con and they got a vendor booth. And but those tables are expensive, especially if you're starting out. You're looking at like over $1,000 for this booth. I don't even know what they are now, but it's not it's
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
inexpensive, especially when you're a young illustrator. And they said, we know you have a web comic for this thing called Centurnia. Hey, why did you join us? Because all the other artists at this booth were comic artists. And I'm like, yeah, sure, that sounds great. And this was May, and the convention was supposed to be in October. And this was I think 2014 at the yeah, it's 2014. And I looked at the work I had done on the webcomic, and it wasn't really enough. I had like maybe a book's worth of
Mm-hmm.
content that I was proud of at that point. And I was like, you know what? I know this story. I've, written and rewritten the story of Centurnia forever. Like, why don't I actually follow my dream, which was an earlier dream I had of producing it as an actual novel. Let's throw the illustration. I mean, I was still going to bring my illustration work to the convention, but actually present Centurnia instead of as a comic as a physical novel. And so between May and October, I worked hard at editing. I hired an academic editor because that's all that's where my connections led me, who did a nice job. And I learned, the Amazon publishing thing, and I put this book together, and it was very nerve-wracking because I had never spent that much money on creating a product that I didn't know was going to sell or not. It was like I think I spent like $1,000, and I remember looking at all these books covering my dining room table. It was like the night before the convention. I'm like, this is crazy. Like, why did I do this? Nobody's going to want this book. But I was pleasantly wrong, and I brought it to the convention, and I sold out of every copy. I think I brought like 60 or 70 to that
Nice.
initial convention, and it sold out. And it was cool because now, years later, some people who bought it from me at New York Comic Con all those years ago are still my fans, and I still hear from them every once in a while when I do a new project. And I'm like, wow, that's just wild. Um, so anyways, I started growing this Centurnia project. To jump back over to the licensing side of my story, um, we had just bought a house, our first
Mm-hmm.
house. It was because I was married at the time and I was pregnant with my daughter. And I started getting nervous when I was looking at the mortgage, and I'm like, I feel like I should get some other form of income. And I decided, why don't I try this licensing thing for the heck of it? So I reached out to several licensing agents, and one of them was Joe Tate of Tate Licensing, the same guy who represented Bridget Ashwood, the artist who I'd
Yes.
been following on the YouTube channel. He also represents Amy Brown, who when
Wow.
I was a teenager, oh my gosh, walking in a Hot Topic and seeing those Amy Brown fairies, I was like, there is nothing more than like for me, she was the epitome of like that is an amazing artist. Like she is so
Yes.
good. I still love her work. Joe Tate also represents the estate of Frank Frazetta, Nene Thomas, like
Yeah,
all these
yeah.
other Tom Wood has like all these. So I was like, this is the lark. I am just gonna send in my portfolio and see what happens. And on his website, there's a statement that says, we will get back to you in 2 weeks. Within 2 hours, I got an email back from him, and he
Uh,
absolutely fell in love with my time dragons. And he's like, these are cool. Because the thing about Joe and the work he does, so he does genre art, but really he's a fantasy nerd at his heart. Like when he started doing things, he started doing Ren fairs. Like that's how he got into art licensing.
oh
And I
wow.
mean that's a
Wow.
whole long story. And man, if I
That's
could, at some
incredible.
point I got to connect you with him because he's fun to talk to because the
Mm-hmm.
stories he has to tell. So for him, his visceral reaction to something is like, that's a cool image. I'd love to see that as a figurine. So it's not only the marketing business side of him, but it's the side of him who has a very sincere appreciation for the genre, which
Mm-hmm.
is absolutely wonderful. So he reacted very strongly to my Time Dragons, and he approached me and was like, "Hey, let's see if we can make this happen." So he started taking my portfolio and shopping it around to the different manufacturers. And at first, we started with Heaven and Earth Designs, who they produce cross stitch. And when I say
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
cross stitch, I don't know if you're familiar with the company, but these cross stitch are amazingly elaborate. Like somebody who puts one of these together spends at least a year or two
Oh
trying,
yeah,
like
there's a lot
stitching
of
them.
yeah, the embroidery companies and cross stitch and stuff. Those things are intense.
Oh my goodness. But so they picked up my work, and then within about I think it took about a year, but a company, I think it was Unicorn Studios, did like my Time Dragons, and they did produce them. They produced two of them, the Time Dragon Scarlet and the Time Dragon and Emerald. And wow, that was an intense feeling to see my art reproduced as a sculpture that would, or figurine rather, that then would goes into like gift shops. Like I remember seeing it at a gift shop in Universal Studios, and I was
Oh,
like,
wow.
holy cow, this is the real deal. And still now occasionally I will walk into like, the little local gift shop, and occasionally I will see my art on the shelves, and that's just the craziest feeling. Like, whoa, I did that happened. Like that's it. That's really the fun side of licensing right there. You just never know where your art is going to end up, and it's
Yes,
always a
yeah.
surprise because once it's out in the wild, like you have no control of it. I have no idea where these manufacturers sell to. I don't. It's just they're just out there, and it's wild. So, um, okay, where was I in my story? Did you have
Oh,
any
you were talking
questions
about
before
license.
I?
I mean, I think it's a really interesting journey. I mean, hearing about how you ended up in licensing. And so, when did the puzzle licensing come in? Because you were doing licensing so for sculpture and that sort of thing, and then
Yeah.
and
And
then it led to.
yes. So like at that point I had several licensing licenses out. I think I had worked with card.com that they make
Mm-hmm,
Visa
mm-hmm.
cards. So it's like you can get my
Oh,
unicorns
wow.
on. Yeah, it's like credit card. It's so interesting. And then also some other companies that had done like greeting cards and cell phone cases and things like that. But so the puzzle art, okay, so I've got kind of an interesting convoluted story about how I got into the puzzle art. And it's kind of I'll I'll just dive right in. So 2008, yeah, it's 2018. Okay, that was a big, crazy, chaotic year for me. Actually, no, excuse me, 2017. This was 2017. So I had my daughter. I was
Mm-hmm.
pregnant with my son. This is where my story gets dark because that's when I was diagnosed with a brain tumor
Oh
when I
my
was pregnant
gosh.
with my son. Yeah, yeah, fun. But
Oh my
I swear it's
gosh.
relevant. It's relevant to this story. Otherwise, I don't like just tossing that out there because it's not like I want sympathy. And it was known to be a benign brain tumor early on based on the imagery. There was very high percentages called an acoustic neuroma or vestibular schwannoma for anyone's interesting. It's a tumor. It's on the nerve that connects my ear to my brain.
Oh,
So
interesting.
it's not in my brain, but it like hangs out on my brain stem and presses on some nerves that are kind of critical and kind of important to the function of your face. And it's a thing. And usually people who have these, they grow very slow over the course of 10 years. And mine was treated with radiation because I had an option to do radiation or surgery, and it was treated with radiation after my son was born. So I was very, very fortunate in that regard. But it was still a lot of upheaval because, here I already had a 2-year old, a newborn, and I was getting treated for a brain tumor when my newborn was about a month old. So a lot of emotional upheaval. Also, at the same time, I had been involved as um, I was basically the program coordinator for an art and technology summer camp because I had still continued doing the teaching thing. And I had been working for this summer camp, I think, for about 6 or 7 years. And I had started out as a teacher for them. And then I had just become their director basically. And I
Wow.
was I was supervising over 20 different employees. We usually had about 600 students in the camp every summer, but it was seasonal in that usually in the fall, my workload would lighten up to the point where it was technically contract. So I wasn't usually working in November, December, which is around the same time I had my son and I was treated for my brain tumor. So it was okay. What happened though is January of that year rolled around of the following year. So here I'd been through the treatment for my brain tumor. Um, Things were, as far as the tumor growth goes, it was considered a successful treatment. But anytime you're messing with radiation in the brain, it's a frustrating experience. So I've been experiencing some side effects, and I had my kid, and in January I got this really like um I don't want to say unprofessional, but this email in which I was basically told that there was a restructuring in the department that funded this summer camp program that I had been involved with for like 6 or 7 years. And basically, if I wanted my job, I had to take it at half what I was being paid
Whoa.
previously to run the whole show. And I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. I'm like, so my program is
No.
successful. We've gotten more and more students over the years. I had added all these really cool topics. I'm this cool combination of like, not only did I understand the educational aspect, but the technology aspect of it because it's art and tech. I mean, we were doing things like Minecraft classes and and
Yeah.
they're like, oh, I'm sorry, there's a restructuring. Here's your job at half. And I'm like, no, if anything, you should be paying me more instead of half. So I was
Wow.
angry. Oh, I was so frustrated. And I think I was going through a lot of emotional upheaval at the same time because I had just been through this whole brain tumor thing. And I had this fear because some people who have the whole brain tumor thing, like I did with the acoustic neuroma, sometimes they have very bad physical effects that have impacts on them for the rest of their lives. And so I was just in a really dark state at that point, trying to figure out, okay, where do I go next? You know, this was a significant part of my income. I was very bitter that they just cut me, just like there was no warning. It wasn't like my performance was bad. In fact, they had written me a wonderful performance review just like a few months prior. And it was just
Wow.
like, bye. And I'm like, so in my anger, I decided to just basically like say like screw them, screw the world, screw everybody. I am just going to paint unicorns because that is like
That
that
is
was
the
the thing.
best response to
Going
anything.
back to everything, I'm like that is like I'm just gonna like F them. I'm just gonna paint unicorns. I'm just like there's a and because there was a part of me that I was like still kind of crawling out
Yeah,
of
yeah.
this recovery, and I was like, you know what? If nothing else, I am still me because I could paint unicorns. So this is
Uh-huh.
where I painted Twilight Marketplace, which
Oh,
is a
wow.
scene where I have these two unicorns and they're running through this outdoor scene where it's a marketplace scene, and that was the most detailed painting I've ever done. I did a lot of
Hmm.
intricacy into the way the decorative things on the unicorn's bridle and saddle. I tried to get very more elaborate and dynamic with my lighting. Tried to tell more of a story. I poured my soul into this drawing. And I also was like, I'm going to spend longer than I've ever spent on a drawing. I think I put like 80 hours into that. And at that point, I hadn't really even learned how to time myself. I was like, I'm just going to throw everything into this piece. Fast forward a couple months later, it's May. I go to New York City for Surtex, which stands for Surface Texture. It's a
Yeah, I've been to
licensing show.
Surtex before.
Okay, so you're
Yeah.
familiar
Uh-huh.
with it. So I'm there with my agent, and I have this piece in my port. First time I've ever attended a licensing show. And the art director for Ravensburger, she's looking through my portfolio and she sees Twilight Marketplace and she absolutely falls in love with it. But what she says is like, we love this, but we really want dragons. Can you do
Oh,
something like this, but with dragons? Kind of like your time dragon. So it's basically, I proved myself through the Twilight Marketplace piece, but it wasn't quite aligning with what they had for their marketing goals. But she saw what I did with the time dragons and she's like, well, just put them together. And what can you do for us? And I'm like, yes. And she's like, can you do this by the end of the summer? And this is May, right? And once again, I have a 2.5-year-old at this point and I think Enzo was like 8 months, 7 months old. Young, okay. If anyone has children, you understand the impact of those ages. Like those are not easy ages to deal with, and to be tossed to this project. And I'm like, of course I'm going to say yes. You know, like be damned everything else because I was still kind of at my victorious climbing and reimagining of it. I was like a broken phoenix still at
yes,
that
yes.
point. And so I said, yes, I'm going to do this. And that summer, oh, it was crazy because at the time I hadn't started yet working with an iPad. So everything I was doing was still on my Cintiq. So I was still chained to my desktop. I was a work from home mom. My husband worked full time out of the house. So I was still technically responsible for my children. And basically any spare moment, morning or night, I had learned to breastfeed and like hold my kid while holding my Wacom stylus in the other hand because like
Wow,
nothing
that's
was gonna stop.
dedication.
Oh my God. But you had to because when the kid was eating, the kid was happy. And if the kid is happy, then mommy can draw. And like my kid would
Yeah.
be my other daughter, she was watching Sesame Street. I also fortunately had a few neighbors who were super kind enough to take my kids for some afternoons here and there to buy me that time. And I don't know how I did it, but I made that deadline. I absolutely made that deadline. I put, and this is Dragon Valley, which is the first piece that came out with Ravensburger, and that was a 2000 piece. And the art director, she was absolutely wonderful because I had never done a puzzle illustration before. So she kind of taught me, the subtle things that they look for in the composition, and her art direction was just so clear, so kind, so generous, so like really giving me free agency to, once I presented to her the initial sketch, to like develop it into what I wanted to. And she didn't micromanage it, but she also was like, here, just add some butterflies here, add some, birds in this area, just to
Amazing.
really make it
Wow.
was just I absolutely loved that art director. And yeah, so that happened. And by that point, I kind of felt like a whole different person because I had gotten through the medical things. I'd gotten through basically being laid off and just kind of swept aside. I did reimagine my career basically with that moment of like, fuck this, I'm gonna draw a unicorn. I'm sorry if you have to beat me out, but like, but that was it.
No,
That
no
was the
worries. No
feeling
worries.
at the
You
time.
won't have to.
But yeah, that was that moment. And then so that brings me to fall of 2018, and I had that Saturnia thing like waiting off in the wings, and I'm like, hey, I need to finish my second novel. So as
Hmm.
soon as I finished Dragon Valley, I poured more work into getting the second novel together. So then that was ready for the conventions in the fall.
Uh-huh.
And like I launched that book, and that was awesome. I got invited to Wizarding Weekend Ithaca, which was a pretty large event down in Ithaca, New York, that was kind of like Harry Potter themed.
Oh yeah, Ithaca's great.
And for that book, then that's how I when I was editing my second book, I started working with Keith R. De Candido, who was an awesome sci-fi author and editor. And so when my second book came out, it was even stronger. And then let's fast forward to spring of the following year. Licensing Expo in Vegas was a show that came up. And before I went to the show, now that I already had the one Ravensburger piece under my belt, I did a bunch of sketches because now I had an understanding of the puzzle industry. I knew there was going to be puzzle companies going to that
Hmm.
show. And I'm like, okay, I'm going to target them. I'm going to look at their catalogs. I'm going to see what they typically publish, and I'm going to try to pitch some ideas. Well, I fortunately got a conversation with Buffalo Games, and the art director at the time was in love with fantasy, really
Oh,
understood
that's awesome.
storytelling. He came from I believe his background, he would work in the movie industry in LA before he had come to work for Buffalo Games. And he looked at my concepts, and three of them right off the bat, he was like, yeah, we want to see these as puzzles. And that was Dragon's Garden, Dragon's Race into the Night. And then he saw Twilight Marketplace, and he was like, hey, this is cool. Can you just add like a border around it with a few more elements, and we'll totally pick this up? And I'm like, yes. So now even Twilight Marketplace got its place as a
Oh,
puzzle.
that's really awesome. Yeah, I'm
Oh, it
looking at
was
your puzzles right
amazing.
now on your website, and they're just amazing. It's
Thank
really
you.
cool. And so that's, it's interesting hearing your story because one thing, as we both educated people that are wanting to do illustration, it's really hard to figure out what is the best advice to give students, and they get so much, I don't want to say inaccurate advice,
Hmm.
but a lot of stuff like in illustration is licensed, for example. So
Hmm.
for years, like when they take fine arts classes and stuff, they're told, don't ever draw fan art or whatever,
Hmm.
when like maybe over 50% of the illustration industry now is licensed properties. And so
Hmm.
you have to be able to draw stuff like that. I always show my students that Venn diagram that says, what people say you should put in your portfolio, what you put in your portfolio, and then what you want to draw. And it's separate. And I separate.
Yep.
And I always tell people to draw what they want
Hmm.
to get hired to do. And I think that's a really important message because you've drawn what you like to do and found a way to sell it. And so many aspiring illustrators are told not to draw what they want because the perceptions of what the industry is are somewhat outdated.
Hmm.
Like, for
Yeah.
example, editorial illustration is sort of, I don't want to use the word dinosaur, but it's sort of a relic of a previous hierarchy of publishing, and all of publishing is constantly changing. So it's hard to aspire to something that has a structure that's not in existence anymore. Like, for
Hmm.
example, newspapers earlier this year got rid of almost all of their editorial cartoonists,
Hmm.
which is
Wow.
terrible and sad news. But that seems like it's increasingly, like journalism, a profession that you can't get paid for anymore.
Yeah, it's amazing, even the shift between when I graduated to now, and then also to look back and see the shifts that happened before that. Like I know before we started recording, you and I were talking about like the stock illustration industry and how when that or stock photography, how like when that came
Yes.
out, it was
Hmm.
considered, oh, this is going to be the illustration killer. And it wasn't quite, it just kind of, it definitely took some jobs, but not all jobs. And then yeah, seeing the giant shift from print to digital like that has happened. Like I don't even think my kids know what a newspaper is. Like for them, it's like that's that thing we use when we do paper mache art projects. And
That's
it's
really
like,
funny that you don't look at it as something to read, but it's something to make
yeah,
crafts with.
yeah, but really that is their perception. And like we don't buy magazines anymore, even
Oh yeah, I
yeah,
don't get any
it's just
magazines anymore or anything. I
yeah.
mean, and that is the editorial industry. It's there are magazines, but really the print stuff I buy is art books,
Hmm.
kids books. I mean, confidentially, and this is a good segue because you've been talking about finding someone to read your book as an audiobook, and
Hmm.
I confess most of the time when I read now, it's through Audible. Like I listen to
Hmm.
audiobooks while I'm painting.
Hmm.
And so that's currently what you're working on right now. You've written the fourth book, right?
Yeah, so the fourth, so I've released the third book. The fourth book is almost done.
Yes.
And what I did recently, and this is what I've been talking about. So that first book, if you recall, I said I produced it in 2014, and it was, you know, the best I could do for the time. What I've done since then is I've looked and I've really grown as an author since that time. And I've also, because I've been working with Keith, and he is such a fantastic editor, and he's in industry. And I should say both Keith and his wife Ren also is involved in the editing of my book. So I don't want to leave her out because like her comments are also so valuable and so useful, and it just kind of changed how I've structured some of my writing. So anyways, my second book and my third book got their golden touch, so to speak. And then I look back at my first book and I'm like, you know what? I'm proud of what I accomplished at the time, but it's not as good. So I was like, you know what? The wonderful thing about indie publishing is I don't have to leave it as a static thing. It doesn't have to just stay that way. So this past year I went back and I brought the first book to Keith, and I was like, "Hey, can you re-edit this for me?" And he went through, and I also started working with an assistant, Sparrow Potter. I don't want to discredit her work too, because she is also an editor. So she came in to do some technical editing and also to bring me in because she's a younger artist. She had a slightly different perspective on a few of the minor details of the book. Anyway, so we changed things up, we redid it, and we released it last month at Anime Boston. I brought the new series, and so if you see it out there in the wild, so right now, if you see it on Amazon, it looks like a brand new book. It's got like 3 reviews as of this conversation. But the thing is, if you look back into the history of the book, if you look at the first edition, it had gotten many more than that. So yeah, so what I'm doing right now is I'm trying to really promote it and put it out there, because I also think for the past several years I was a little timid about promotion because I knew a part of me, I wasn't quite happy with that first book. And I just didn't feel like putting my heart and my money into telling people, hey, buy this book, when I knew there was things about it that I wanted to change. And now I've done it and it's there, and I'm like super proud of it. And it really um, strengthens the entire series. And I have that out there. And I can't even remember what the first question was you asked me, and before I got to
Well,
this
we were
tangent.
talking
Yeah.
about your journey to the audiobook because you were saying that you're about to release the fourth. book
Yes.
in the
Uh-huh.
series. And then you were also, I think I saw a post on Facebook where you were looking at people to read the books. So what is that process like to find someone to read
Oh
your audiobook?
my
And are
goodness.
they doing the first one? Are they doing the first book?
Yeah, so we're going to start with the first book, because what I found that, just like you, even though like as a child I was a voracious reader, as a teenager I was a voracious reader. I think sometimes when I became an adult, just the hours didn't exist anymore in the day. But now as I do my illustration work, I am always listening to audiobooks, and I think that's just a thing now with adults, that Audible is becoming, a huge market. So I'm like, you know what, this is an area that is definitely untapped for me, because I'd also found that at conventions, sometimes I talk to people who are huge fans of fantasy, huge fans of books, and they're just like, oh, I just don't have the time to read, but I listen on my morning commute. And I'm like, okay, I need to do this audiobook thing. The thing about audiobooks right now, so as far as financing their creation, you have two options. You have royalty share. If now this is talking about Audible. Now I know there's other companies that produce audiobooks, but let's be real here right now. Fortunately or unfortunately, and maybe I'll say this unfortunately on the side, that Amazon owns the market share. I put out a survey to my friends. I'm like, what company do you use? Where do you get your audiobooks? But I think many of us have done the thing where you signed up for the Audible
We
subscription
get the credit
service.
every month. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Now I have like 5 credits sitting in the
I
account I
think I
share
have
with my
6.
husband. Oh my God. And see, this is it. So you're never going to leave Audible, because you just keep going back. And now I have my whole library in Audible, and it's a thing. So that's why I've been exclusively dealing with Audible. So, anyways, you have the option of either doing royalty share with a narrator, or you could pay them outright, and it's in finished. It's like it's a per hour for per hour of finished audio. So to give you an example, my book is 120,000 words, which amounts to approximately, they have a nice little calculator for this, 13 finished hours of finished audio, and the bare minimum you're going to pay for a narrator is at least $100 an hour. So you're looking at bare minimum $1,300 is the cost up front to have this happen. Now, as I said, there's also the royalty share option, but me as an artist, as someone who's worked as an art director, as an educator, I just feel like it's kind of almost like asking a narrator to do something on spec. Like it
Yes.
doesn't feel right for me, because you know what? Reality is, okay, yes, the book did well at conventions,
Mhm.
but it hasn't really done as well on online sales. And I don't know if this is even going to turn a profit. So it feels wrong to me to ask somebody to spend, and then editing, okay, like I said, 13 finished hours, but that means that somebody spent twice as long actually doing the narration, editing their narration, making sure it's perfect. I don't want somebody to spend 2, 3, 4 weeks of their life on making something that only turns like $100 worth of profit for them in the royalty share. So I am,
Oh, yes, totally.
oh, it's just wrong to me. So I'm approaching this that I want to pay for those hours up front, because I feel like that is the right thing to do as a creator.
Mhm.
So I put that in my audition. I put that, and then now we've got this different thing. So Audible, you could choose the different scales of what you pay. So there's like the $100 to $200 for finished hour, 200 to 400, and then there's 400 to a thousand, right?
So
So
it's
you
like
could
if
think
you
that.
like pick Will Wheaton to do it, it's like $1,000
Oh
an
my
hour.
God. Like I was like looking at that. I'm like, just to do my first book, that's more than my first car cost me. I'm like, that's a little much for a project that I have no idea if it's going to be successful. And I'm like, so now, so I put the audition information out there, and I've gotten, I think as of this morning, like 51 submissions. And I'm like,
Whoa.
holy cow. And it's this huge range of, there's some people who you can tell are just, using their iPhone mic, who are kind of aspiring
Mhm.
audiobook narrators. And then there's kind of this mid-level of people who have maybe done a couple audiobooks, and maybe done some commercial work.
Mhm.
So you got that mid-level, and then you have the slightly higher tier people who have done, over 100, 200 audiobooks. And you really, for many of these, you could hear the difference right off the bat for
Hmm.
somebody who is
Hmm.
very familiar. So now I have this challenge of, okay, I need to select someone who I feel embodies what I hope Centurnia sounds like. And that's a funny thing too, because you got these characters in your head and you kind of have a vague idea of what they sound like. But I feel like, when you, as an illustrator, when you get that client that says to you, I don't know what I want, but I'll know it when I see it. Like, have you had clients say that to
Yeah,
you?
yeah.
Oh
Hmm.
my gosh. But now I feel like I'm that client. I'm like, yeah, I really don't know what I want to hear, but I'll
Yeah.
know it when I see it. And I'm like, okay, so now I have to figure that out. So that intersection of, okay, does this sound right? Is this person going to deliver a product? And then there's this other voice in my head that's like, okay, so a couple narrators who submitted have substantial credits or have read for authors who I adore, like Mercedes Lackey. But of course, with experience come cost. And I'm like, oh my gosh, now how much is me as a business, as an investor, how much money am I willing to put out there to have this
Well, that's
happen?
where a
Oh,
Kickstarter could help. Is you could get to. I mean, that's kind of what I did with my book. Is it helped pay for the editorial and the design, or it did pay for that. That and Patreon were kind of what I did. So that is perhaps a way to finance that and get sort of a nicer audiobook.
hmm. Like I love that. I have never done a Kickstarter. Obviously, many of my friends have had experience. So tell me, like, what are, now that it was your sketching book, was that your first project with
That's my
Kickstarter?
first solo one. So I've run two Kickstarters. We did a comic anthology in Cincinnati. We still
Hmm.
do the podcast for it, Cincinnati Cabinet of Curiosities, which has been a ton of fun. And we took a bunch of local Cincinnati artists and told stories of Cincinnati lore. And so those were good projects to break in on,
Hmm.
doing the comic project. And so the sketching here and there everywhere was sort of my first solo project where I've done everything. And that is scary when you're first jumping into it because you're like, how many people am I going to get? Will I people for years had been saying, why don't you do a book on sketching? And I was interested in doing that, but I ended up sort of wanting to have more control over it, so I decided to publish it myself and hire my editor and designer, and I think it worked out really well. The book comes back from the printer next week and I hope to start shipping it like next week. But I think that since you already have established people reading it, I think that that is a good plus.
Hmm. Yeah. One thing though that I don't know is this intersection of, okay, are my fans readers, and like, or because they bought the book, are they not interested in the audiobooks? Like, I feel like I'm going after the audience of people who are like, oh, I really love to read your book, Rose, but I don't
Well, I have
read
to
anymore.
confess that
You know?
I just bought all of Anne McCaffrey's series on Audible.
Oh,
I had
she
read
is
all of
so
those
good.
books. I had read all those books as a kid, so
Hmm.
but it's nice to listen to them. It's interesting because we were talking about the controversy of AI earlier. What about
Hmm.
the bigger controversy? Are you still reading a book if you're listening to the audiobook? Because there is debate over that, where some people have said
Oh.
if you listen to the book, is it still considered reading it? I think it is,
Hmm.
but it is a different way to take in a book. I've talked to people that are in book clubs that have said that when the people that listen to the audiobook have a slightly different take on the book than people that read it, which is interesting, but I think it's equally valid. I don't know
Hmm.
how you feel about it.
Oh, that is an absolutely wonderful question that I had never considered, because I do understand why a narrator would kind of color your perception of a book, because a good narrator is someone who has that, the way a character says something, if they have a different inflection to their voice, it changes how you perceive what they're saying. So like a good narrator is able to convey that to an author's true intent. But then again, as you're reading a book, there has been times that people have taken what I have had characters say and interpret them in a slightly different way than I intended. And I guess that's the kind of like the self-interpretation. Oh man, I don't, and honestly, when I'm having conversations with people, I think I kind of treat it like, oh yeah, I read that book, or like, oh, like
I always just say I
that's
read it.
yeah, I have I really think about this. Like I have a tendency to say I read it as well, and
Well,
I'm like,
it's
oh yeah.
interesting. Well, we'll have to see if anyone weighs in on that because it's an interesting because I've heard people say before that they don't consider that reading it, but almost everyone I know, that's how they read books these days is but and of course most of our friends are artists and working at
Hmm.
home, and so most
Yeah.
of them that's how they or even on road trips and stuff listen to audiobooks. It's become a really valid way to take in a book. But I have to say, like, there was one book that I listened to years ago, and it was The Lightning Thief.
Hmm.
And the narrator, the way he interpreted, and he wasn't a bad narrator, but the way he interpreted the way a lot of the characters talked made me not read the rest of the books.
See,
And it
that's
wasn't his fault. It was just probably like the way he made like some of the characters talk, it made me less interested in the story and it didn't encourage me to
yeah. Oh,
read
that must have
more of
been
the
so
books.
frustrating for that author, because I know that that was a big name title,
It's
right?
a
That's
huge
Percy
Rick
Jackson,
Riordan.
right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so
I don't know if
like
that's how you pronounce his name, but
yeah, but
yeah.
I assume that because it was with a big publishing house that they probably controlled who did the narration. And this poor author is, and the same way authors will be like, "Oh, I dislike the illustration on the cover of my book," but they have like they lose that element of control. Like, oh, that's
Yeah, yeah. It's definitely
interesting.
something to think of when you're picking your narrator too. Is this something that somebody wants to listen to for 13 hours? And
Hmm.
when you like read some of the reviews on Audible, it's interesting to see what they'll say about the different narrators and that sort of thing. And obviously some are much better than others at conveying the story. It's really, I would think reading a book like that is much harder than it looks. I know
Oh
when
my
I'm trying
God.
to read text
Hmm.
for anything, it's so easy to stumble. Like it's really hard. Even reading
Hmm.
these bios for this show, like it's so easy. Like, and it seems once you get off track, like you really get off track, and so it's fascinating. I'm interested to hear how the rest of your process goes with this. I'm excited
Oh
to
my
see.
goodness.
I want to.
It's just I really should share it because it's interesting to see it. So like I said, I have these 50 readings to go through. And then there's also the me as a creator who like I know every one of these people put maybe an hour's worth of time to bid for this
Yes,
job. And I'm like, oh, I wish I could hire you all. And it's interesting too, because some of them, so the way Audible works, they have the sample and they could submit like a little paragraph of notes, so a statement. And some people have been like, oh, I went to your website, your art is so cool. Some people are like, oh, this is this such and such character is this cool, and then or they tell me about the work they've done. And it's I get for some of these narrators their personalities as creators, and now it's like, okay, so I have to pick, and this is really hard because it's my own money on the table. I want to like I don't want to have what happened as you're saying to the Percy Jackson narrator there, that it I end up turning people off from the series. And it's an it's way harder than I thought it was going to be. I'm like
well, I'm
I should
interested
definitely.
in seeing the journey as it goes on. So I'll definitely be following that.
Okay.
We're almost at an
Oh,
hour, and before we go, I want to talk a little bit about sketching because you also do urban sketching. You've met with the Orlando group, so do you keep a sketchbook?
oh, I absolutely do. And once again, I have to thank you for recommending Orlando Urban Sketches to me. So, like, what had happened? There was I just put a Facebook post out on the Sisters of Fantastic Art group, and my general post was, "Hey, does anyone know any artists who are in Orlando? Because I just moved here. It was 9 months ago. I was eager to start to meet people in the community." And Christina very kindly said, hey, my friend Noga Rose, she runs the Orlando group of urban sketchers down there. You should talk to her. And I'm like, I had not been familiar with urban sketchers prior to you mentioning the group at all to me. And I'm like, wow, like where has this been all my life? Because I do enjoy, I always have a sketchbook with me. I tend to basically sketch whenever I'm bored. Like usually it's like I'll have a sketchbook with me when we go to restaurants or something like that because as I'm waiting for the food to come out, like that tends to be when I do my most urban sketching.
Yes, yes.
And so that's how I'd gotten into it. But then for those of you who aren't familiar with Urban Sketchers. So it's a larger organization. Basically, artists will meet up at different locations, usually, something like a park or a really cute little city street. Or now that I'm down here in the basically the land of theme parks, we just did a meetup at Disney Springs, which is
Oh,
like
nice.
really, oh, that was so much fun. And basically, we just hang out for a couple hours, draw, and then share our work. And it's just a wonderful way to meet other artists in the community and then also to, work on your skills. And I know sometimes at least when I used to talk to my students, I would find some of them would be very self-conscious about drawing in a public area. But when you're already with a group of like 15 people sitting around drawing the same tree, it does not feel awkward. It feels like you're part of a thing. And it's just wonderful. So yeah, so I always have a sketchbook with me. I will definitely say since I moved to Orlando, I've been sketching even more. So we have a tendency, my family, to because we have the Florida resident passes for both Universal Studios and Disney World. We're still at this phase where we kind of go to the theme parks maybe once a week.
Oh, that's
And
awesome.
yeah, it's really cool. And oh, it's so much fun drawing theme parks. I'm actually one of my neighbors, her background is in theatrical design, and
Oh,
she has
nice.
become she works for one of the companies that actually works on designing the new area. So the company she works for, they did the Harry Potter Hogsmeade over in Universal, and now she's working on Epic Universe. But her background as a theater designer, when you're looking at any part of a theme park, it is all very deliberately laid out to really control your eye. And you see that as an artist, as you're sitting there drawing the environments around you, you could see how things are textured and layered in such a way to control the theme park goer's eye. It's so fascinating and something I had never considered as an artist. And I'd like to think that it's also helping me with my puzzle designs because puzzles are elaborate, layered environments, like thinking of it as like a theater stage. And now I see that in the way the theme parks are laid out, and it all comes full circle. It's so cool. So, anyway, so with my sketching, like I said, where I'm in the theme parks maybe once a week. Just a byproduct of being in a theme park, you're often waiting in a line, whether it's for a ride or your food or whatever. And that's typically when I pull out my sketchbook. So I've got a lot of sketches of various aspects of some of the rides in these theme parks. And that's when I do a lot of my sketching. And now my children, so I have a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, they've really caught on to this in a way that I had never considered. And now both of them have their own sketchbooks and
Oh,
I
that's
keep them in
really
my bag,
cool.
and they will do the same thing. They're like, okay, well, we're bored in a line. What's my option? I'll draw. And my daughter in particular has taken on, and she's only 7, the whole urban sketching thing. She will look at an environment and she will also try to draw it. And she is so happy to do this. And I brought her to an Orlando Urban Sketchers meetup, the one that was in Disney Springs. And, she was sitting there with everybody else, and she was able to keep focus for over an hour or two, which, I've had some high school students who weren't capable of that. And it's really taught me a lot as an educator because I had, with my art education background, I previously thought that because the brain doesn't typically understand perspective until you're about 11 or 12 years old. That's when the part of the brain that can really interpret perspective really starts to develop. I had thought that plein air or urban sketching was, better for an older student. But now I see the way my daughter interprets things, and it might not have the same depth or perspective that you and I could do, but still, it's like her attention to detail and being able to capture, like, oh, here's a certain tree, here's the way the flowers, here's the fountain, here was this food stand, and she'll capture all of those elements with this wonderful freedom and focus. And it's so cool. So urban sketching has really become a large part of my life, since I moved down here. And once again, like, I'm so glad you mentioned the group to me. And I will say to anyone who lives in a slightly larger city, or just at least research to see if you have an urban sketchers chapter near you, because it's absolutely worth it, and it's wonderful, and it's totally become a part of my life. So I encourage all
I'm
artists to
so
look for
glad
this.
that It's been so fun.
Mhm.
That's really exciting. And hearing about your daughter too that's amazing.
Yeah.
So we should probably wrap up. Where can people find you? What are your socials?
Okay, so the biggest place I'm trying to encourage people to do is go directly to my website, which is rosecatcahn.com. That's Kahn spelled Khan, so that's Rosecatcahn. If you search Rose Cat Kahn, rosecatherine.com, anything like that in Google, it's going to lead you to my website. Also, centurnia.com. That's Centurnia spelled with a C, Centernia. If you just search Rose Catherine Kahn and Centurnia, something will come up. And certainly you can find all my social media networks through that. I do have a YouTube channel, I have a Twitter, I have a Facebook, I have an Instagram. But as we've seen over the years, social media is not necessarily something you can rely on. And I will say for me and any other artists, for those of you who are following, I encourage you to go sign up for their mailing list because email seems to be the most um, method of communication that can actually be relied upon. And I'll also put a plug for my book. If you enjoy fantasy worlds that have LGBT characters, that have castles, portal fantasy, generational trauma, dragon riders, and a whole lot of good stuff, kind of a little bit of a darker contemporary fantasy, please check out Centurnia. And yeah, I
Well,
think
thanks so
that's it.
much.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you. This has been an absolutely wonderful conversation. Absolutely wonderful. So